Where are you? Today, we say our final goodbye to Ryan. Our son passed away, and my husband didn't even show up to the funeral. I'm going to call him. My husband's voice came through the phone, sounding cheerful. I am in Hawaii for my parents' 70th anniversary. My mom listened and was shocked at first, but soon her face turned red with anger. What? They are in Hawaii? Mom lost her temper and decided to confront my husband and his parents. My name is Emily. I'm a 40-year-old office worker. I married my husband, Mike, 10 years ago, and we have one son together. He's currently in the hospital. Our son, Ryan, was diagnosed with leukemia 2 years ago and has been hospitalized ever since. Even though he started elementary school, he couldn't attend much. However, his classmates would occasionally visit, and it made him so happy. Seeing Ryan encouraged by his friends and fighting so hard against his illness gives me strength. My parents also visited Ryan every day. I can't wait for Ryan to be well again, and we can go out for some delicious food together. When my mom said that, Ryan endured his tough treatments bravely. My mom is still in good health, but my dad was diagnosed with dementia a few years ago, and sometimes says things that don't make sense. Thank you for taking care of my grandson. The other day, when my dad came to see Ryan, he mistook me for a nurse and thanked me. It made me feel sad. I was shocked by my dad's words, but I was surprised that he hadn't forgotten about Ryan. It seems like he really understands Ryan's illness. Even if he mistakes me for you, he never forgets about his grandson. Mom said this with a sigh, but it was clear that Dad was really worried about Ryan's illness. Ryan understands dementia too, so when his grandpa says something odd, he plays along nicely. While Ryan's school friends and my parents are worried about him, it seems like my husband doesn't care. Can't you come and visit Ryan sometimes? Aren't you worried about him suffering through his treatments? Ryan doesn't like me, so it's probably better if I stay away. Besides, I'm really busy. It's true that Ryan and his dad didn't get along, but as his father, he should still try to be there for him. Mike never helped with childcare at all after Ryan was born, so it's no wonder Ryan didn't like him. Mike seemed to care more about his own parents than his son. Whenever he had free time, he would go to their place. He was always busy because he had to deal with his parents. My parents-in-law may not care about Ryan. They hardly visit the hospital. Seriously, Mike's so cold-hearted. But do his parents not love Ryan either? Mom was clearly unhappy with Mike and his parents' attitude and complained with a look of disapproval. Particularly, she is annoyed that my husband doesn't come to see his son, and I replied half-jokingly. I might have married the wrong person. He was so kind when we were dating, but now he's cold to both me and Ryan. Even though our son is suffering from a serious illness, my husband only cares about his own parents. It's really starting to annoy me. Mom seemed to think I regretted marrying my husband and looked at me sadly as she said this. If I had known Mike was like this, I would have never introduced him to you. I feel like I was deceived by the uncle who introduced us. My husband and I met through my father's brother. It seems my uncle and my father-in-law knew each other, and when they discussed a potential wife for Mike, my name came up. Back then, I wasn't seeing anyone, so I decided to meet Mike casually. He seemed kind, and I had a good impression of him, but I wasn't ready for marriage yet. However, Mike seemed to really like me and asked if we could start dating seriously, and before I knew it, we were getting married. His parents' attitude also changed completely after you two got married, didn't it? My mom also seemed dissatisfied with Mike's parents, and I felt the same way. Before we got married, they seemed humble, but after we got married, they turned into completely different people. Emily, you're part of this family now, so you need to do as I say. If you don't listen, we'll make sure you get a proper divorce quickly. My mother-in-law, who was always smiling before the wedding, suddenly turned strict and spoke to me harshly. I thought my father-in-law was a quiet man, but he started making insulting remarks.
We only let you marry Mike because the head of our family introduced you. Otherwise, there's no way we would have let someone like you marry our son.
He would say that whenever something came up. My uncle runs a real estate company and my father-in-law has a contract with it. When he introduced me, my uncle apparently mentioned that I was the daughter of a wealthy family. As a result, my father-in-law seemed to believe my father owned significant properties, which is why he made those remarks. I hadn't heard about any of this from my father or uncle, so I believed what my father-in-law said. After we got married, we moved into the house where my maternal grandparents used to live. My grandparents had passed away and the house was empty, so we renovated it a bit and moved in. My family thought of renting out the house because leaving it vacant would just make it collapse. But when my husband learned about the empty house, he pleaded with my parents.
I promise, we'll take good care of it, so please, let us live there. The house is close to her family too, so we can also help look after her parents.
That made sense. It's near his family too, so we could both keep an eye on our parents. But having his parents living close by, who had changed their attitude so much after the wedding, was only a burden for me. On top of that, Mike would often invite his parents over to our house and start bragging.
My house is new and must make you so jealous. It's a lot bigger, maybe even twice the size of your house.
When Mike talked like he owned the place, his father seemed annoyed, but his mother smiled and said, "We could live together here. It might be an old house, but it's better than where we live now." After they left, I asked my husband about it. "Are you planning to have your parents move in with us? This isn't even your house." When I questioned him, my husband just laughed and said it was a joke. But even if he was joking, my mother-in-law seemed serious about moving in, which made me uneasy. After that, my in-laws kept coming over, looking around the house and saying whatever they wanted.
Living here would be better than our poor house. At least there's no rent in this dump.
I was annoyed when my father-in-law called it a dump, and my mother-in-law ignored me while picking out a room for herself. My husband wasn't speaking up, so I decided to tell them the truth. We're borrowing this house from my parents. My grandparents used to live here, so of course it's a bit old. My in-laws were surprised to hear that, but then my father-in-law quickly responded with an angry look.
That's why it's such a place in poor condition.
He called it poor, but I thought it was better than their house. My mother-in-law didn't seem to believe me and started saying whatever she wanted. "Why are you lying? I trust my son more than you." Even if she didn't believe me, it didn't change the fact that we were borrowing the house. So I didn't say anything more. I was worried about what would happen if my in-laws forced their way into moving in with us. But when I found out I was pregnant, the whole conversation about them moving in disappeared. Maybe they realized they'd have to help take care of the baby if they lived with us, because my in-laws suddenly became quiet. "Emily's parents should take care of the baby. They live nearby, so I won't have to do it." I never asked her to help with the baby, but she said that anyway. Since we lived close to my parents and my in-laws, I couldn't stop thinking she really didn't want to take care of the baby. I wondered how they could not be excited about their first grandchild. But when I told my mom what my mother-in-law said, she just laughed.
Leave the babysitting to me. You don't need to ask someone who doesn't want to take care of a sweet grandchild.
I thought my mom was right, and planned to ask for help once the baby was born. After a while, when my son was born, my parents were excited. But my in-laws only came to visit once. My husband also didn't seem moved by the birth of our son, which was a bit disappointing.
Don't worry. Once the baby arrives, Mike will have affection for him. He might not feel like a father yet. My mom tried to cheer me up, but my husband continued to show no interest in our son. Then, when our son turned 5, he fell ill. After tests at the hospital, he was diagnosed with pediatric cancer. My husband, who was supposed to support me through this shock, said, "You'll have to cover the medical expenses yourself. It's not my problem." I was angry at his attitude as a father.
My mother-in-law also made harsh remarks. It's because Emily passed on her genes that Ryan has cancer. None of our relatives have anything like that, so it must be your fault. Hearing my husband and mother-in-law's comments, my father stood up for me.
Don't you care about Ryan? We'll take care of him, so you can do whatever you want.
My father, who was very supportive at that time, made my husband and in-laws leave quietly. Even though I was already distressed by my son's illness, their harsh words made me even more upset.
Don't be discouraged. Ryan will be upset if you don't stay strong. We'll do everything we can to support you. Let's work together.
Encouraged by my mother, I decided to stay strong for my son. I concluded that I couldn't rely on my husband anymore, and I focused on taking care of our son and working. My parents, who had already retired, were able to help with looking after him, which I was grateful for. Despite the diagnosis of pediatric cancer, my son's condition improved, and he could live almost like a normal child. My husband questioned whether our son really had cancer and accused me of trying to deceive him.
Is Ryan really sick, or are you just trying to fool me?
Seeing our son playing happily, my husband continued to say inappropriate things. I ignored him because talking to him seemed pointless. After the diagnosis, my husband was not always around the house and seemed to be always going back to his parents' place. It was actually easier for me without him around, as he only complained. My parents came to our house to help with our son, which made my husband seem even less interested. However, after our son was hospitalized 2 years ago, my husband started spending more time at home.
Leave the housework to me. You can go to the hospital. By the way, how about giving me this house?
When I came back from the hospital, my husband would smirk and make such comments. I ignored him, but he seemed to be more concerned about the house again. I felt annoyed thinking about his plans to move in with his parents without caring about our son. At this time, my father was diagnosed with dementia, and both my mom and I were busy, so we couldn't focus on our house. We hadn't explained my father's condition to my husband or in-laws. So even when my father came over occasionally, my husband seemed to be unaware of what was happening.
Today your parents came over, but they seemed to be just casually walking around. I wondered if they weren't going to help with Ryan.
It was my husband who was relaxed. Since I couldn't take my father for a walk alone, my mother always accompanied him. Explaining everything seemed like too much trouble, so I said nothing. My uncle also visited occasionally, and often had serious discussions with my mother. I was curious about what they talked about since my uncle looked serious. When I asked my mother, she only gave uncertain answers. While I was worried about my mother and uncle, my son's condition worsened. I had been prepared for it, but realizing how critical it was made me overwhelmed. With my husband unreliable and my father suffering from dementia, I had no choice but to rely on my mother. When I updated my husband on our son's condition, he said something shocking.
I'm busy right now, so stop calling. You handle Ryan's situation.
I was mad at his lack of parental responsibility and seriously considered separating from him. After a while, my son passed away, and I was in such shock that I couldn't do anything. My mother and uncle took care of everything on my behalf, so I was able to stay by my son's side. Then, just before the funeral, my uncle started to panic.
Where are Mike and his parents? They can't skip the funeral, can they?
Seeing my uncle in madness, I called my husband. Where are you? It's time to say the last goodbye to Ryan.
I'm at a party celebrating my parents' anniversary. I told you not to call right now.
I heard my husband's voice through the smartphone, and my mother and uncle were furious. My mother turned red with anger.
He's in Hawaii?
When my mother said that, my uncle started doing something. I had not expected anything from my husband, but hearing he went on a vacation to Hawaii while Ryan was in a dangerous state made me lose my temper. You knew Ryan was in a critical condition and still went on a trip? I feel pity for Ryan for having a father like you. I hung up the phone, and while I was holding back tears, my mother comforted me.
I will never forgive them. Don't worry, everything will be gone by the time they return from Hawaii.
Confused by anger and sadness, I didn't fully understand what my mother was saying. However, I knew I had to stay strong for my son and managed to get through the funeral. Thanks to my uncle and mother, the funeral went smoothly. After the funeral, I was left unable to think clearly. I had centered my life around my son, and now I didn't know what to do next.
Leave the future to me. Emily, you should go back to your parents' house and take it easy.
Following my uncle's advice, I returned to my parents' house and helped take care of my father while settling in. My workplace was considerate and allowed me a long break, which was a relief. When I had almost forgotten about my husband, I received a call from him.
Emily, I can't get into the house. Did you change the locks? Changing them without notice is awful.
Finally, back from his trip, my husband spoke in a panicked tone. I haven't changed the locks. I'm planning to end things with you, so don't call me anymore. After I said that, I immediately hung up. But after a while, my husband called again.
My parents' house has been demolished. What's going on? There's even a land for sale sign up.
I don't understand what you're talking about. I'm going to hang up and check with my uncle. When I checked with my uncle, he seemed pleased and told me to come over to the parents-in-law's family home. I went as instructed to see what was happening. Upon arriving, I found my husband and in-laws standing there looking stunned.
What's the meaning of this? My parents' house is gone.
Is this because we didn't take you on a trip to Hawaii? You tore down the house because of that. I could never do that because I had a funeral to go to. As I was getting frustrated with my mother-in-law's confusing accusation, my uncle and mother arrived.
People who didn't even attend the funeral have no right to complain. You should at least reflect on your actions.
When my mother yelled, Mike and his parents fell silent for a moment, but soon after, my father-in-law began to complain.
You can't just demolish the house and sell the land. I'm the owner of this property.
Seeing my father-in-law's strange claims, I began to doubt whether he might be suffering from dementia. My father-in-law proudly presented a contract.
We got the house and land from your father. There's a contract to prove it.
The contract he showed had my father's signature, but it looked suspiciously unofficial. Moreover, it stated the property was given away for free, which seemed impossible. This contract can't be valid. Besides, my father is suffering from dementia and can't make sound judgments. John and his parents insisted the contract was valid, claiming they didn't know about my father's dementia.
This land is registered under my name, so he cannot sign the contract. You knew my husband was suffering from dementia and forced him to sign the contract, didn't you?
I was shocked by my mother's words, but Mike and his parents were even more unsettled. As my father-in-law refused to believe my mother, my uncle showed everyone the land's details and lease agreement.
The land and the building both belonged to Emily's mother. We had to terminate the lease because you were behind on rent payments and made the property into a for sale sign. It's been quite a while, and despite us repeatedly trying to arrange meetings, you ignored us. We were left with no choice but to take legal action.
When my uncle said this, Mike's parents stared at the documents in silence.
Were you behind on rent? Why didn't you pay?
My father-in-law said,
I thought it was fine since we became relatives with her uncle.
But confused, my mother-in-law started to say the truth. Actually, we were planning to deceive your father into giving us the land, so there was no need to pay the rent. I was shocked by the late payment for the rent, but I got angry to know that they had planned to deceive my father from the start. My anger grew as I almost opened my mouth to protest. At that moment, Mike pulled out a contract and, looking regretful, asked my mother,
Is the house we live in also yours? Does that mean this contract is meaningless too?
The contract Mike was holding had my father's signature, just like the previous one. Mike seemed to have misunderstood, thinking that our home was also my father's and had created a fake contract.
It's ridiculous that they tried to deceive us without even checking who owned the land. I'm glad we found out in time.
My mother said with a look of astonishment, while Mike and his parents were shaking with anger. My mother explained that her father was a significant landowner in the area, including around their home, which shocked me and Mike. Suddenly, a young woman appeared. Please pay for the travel expenses I paid. When will the life insurance for your late son be paid out? Seeing the woman, Mike panicked. The uncle grinned and said,
Even after your son's death, you brought your mistress to Hawaii. You're quite something. We've investigated everything.
I was once again surprised, but quickly realized that the woman was Mike's mistress. It seemed the uncle had suspected Mike of infidelity and has secretly investigated, with my mother and uncle discussing the matter in a serious tone. The woman had emerged from behind a nearby building and didn't fully grasp the situation, realizing she had appeared at an inopportune moment. She hurriedly fled. I didn't think Mike was such a terrible person. Our son must be appalled from heaven. Even as I said this, Mike seemed unaffected and chased after his mistress. I turned to his parents. How does it feel to have enjoyed yourself in Hawaii, relying on the insurance money of your grandchild? Unfortunately, I'm the beneficiary of the insurance, so you'll have to pay for the travel expenses yourself. Unable to retort, Mike's parents hurriedly left. After the funeral, I realized that my mother had meant to completely remove Mike and his parents from our lives. Following this, I divorced Mike and filed for alimony. It turns out my ex-husband had been cheating for 2 years, and he planned to leave me after our son passed away. He thought that once our son was gone, he wouldn't have to pay child support or deal with any responsibilities, and he would benefit from the life insurance. He confessed his infidelity to my in-laws and even took them on a trip to Hawaii. He knew about my father's dementia and took advantage of it by secretly getting my father to sign a contract while our son was in a critical condition. Since both my mother and I were busy with our son's condition, we had left my father in the care of a home helper, which gave him the opportunity to act. He managed to get my father to sign the contract as planned, but apparently he didn't realize that the land was actually owned by my mother. My mother inherited both pieces of land from my father and had entrusted their management to my uncle, who runs a real estate company. My father-in-law, who was renting the land and property from my uncle, mistakenly thought it was still my father's land, which was a major fault. Without thoroughly checking the details, my ex-husband and his parents focused solely on financial gain. They ended up accumulating a large amount of debt. My ex-husband not only has to pay alimony, but also cover the costs for the 4-person trip to Hawaii, which has left him financially strained. My in-laws were also asked to pay overdue rent and turned to their son, my ex-husband, for help, but he could barely handle his own debts. They had initially not paid the rent because they were already struggling with debt. They hoped to clear their debt by acquiring the land, but it turned out to be my mother's property. Burdened with debt, my ex-husband has even lost his mistress and is now living alone and in misery. Returning to my family home, I'm finally starting to recover from the shock of losing my son. Since my mother is also struggling with my father's dementia, I can't afford to stay depressed forever. Seeing my lack of energy, I believe my son in heaven would be worried, so I want to stay positive within my limits. My father sometimes says strange things, like today he mentioned, "Ryan is visiting and running around happily." I was taken aback by his words, but maybe my father can still see my son. I'll choose to believe that my son is watching over us and that we should live cheerfully for his sake.